The door of the Graves farmhouse closed with the sound of a coffin lid sealing. It was a final wooden thud that echoed the finality in her father-in-law's eyes. Elara stood on the porch, the dust of the yard already settling on her black mourning dress. In her palm were 3 silver dollars, the weight of them both an insult and a sentence. Mr. Graves, the patriarch of Promise Creek, and a man whose heart was as hard as the granite he quarried, had made his judgment clear. His son Thomas was gone, and with him any tolerance for the woman he had married. A debt was outstanding, he had declared in the cold parlor, flanked by his 2 other sons, their faces grim and obedient. He produced a ledger. The numbers were a fiction, a cruel piece of theater, but in a town built on his wealth and influence, his ledger was law. The farm, the livestock, the life she and Thomas had built with their own hands, were now his. All of it, swallowed by a phantom debt. She was left with the clothes on her back, the 3 coins, and a folded deed he'd tossed on the table like a piece of trash. It was for a tract of land north of town, a place known to the children as the Dragon's Maw, and to the adults as Graves' Folly. It was an abandoned, fire-scorched quarry, a failed venture from 2 decades prior, considered not just worthless, but cursed. It was a piece of land so barren and hostile that giving it to her was a final, public act of scorn. The community of Promise Creek watched her departure. They were not cruel, not actively. They were practitioners of a careful, frontier pity. The women in their bonnets whispered behind their hands, their expressions a blend of sympathy and relief that it was not them. Mr. Finch, the owner of the town mercantile, stepped out onto his boardwalk, wiping his hands on his apron. He was a man who dispensed wisdom as freely as he dispensed flour and salt. "The stage goes east in the morning, Elara," he called out, his voice carrying a tone of reasonable authority. "Those dollars will buy you a ticket to a place with family. There is nothing for you out there." He gestured vaguely toward the jagged hills rising in the north. He was offering her the sensible path, the path of surrender, giving up the land, taking charity, disappearing. But something in her had broken and then reset, harder than before. It was the injustice, the cold, legalistic theft of her life. To accept his advice would be to validate their judgment, that she was helpless, a problem to be sent away. She looked at Mr. Finch, her face pale, but her eyes holding a new, unsettling stillness. She walked past the stairs and whispers, her worn boots kicking up the same dust that now belonged to another. She did not walk toward the stagecoach office. She walked into Mr. Finch's mercantile. The bell above the door chimed, a sound that had once meant comfort and community. Now it sounded like an alarm. The store was empty of customers, but full of the scent of burlap, coffee, and dried apples. Mr. Finch followed her in, his brow furrowed with concern that felt more like impatience. "Now, Elara," he began. She placed 2 of the 3 silver dollars on the worn wooden counter. They made a sharp, definitive sound. "I need a good axe," she said, her voice low but clear. "A felling axe, and the best shovel you have." Mr. Finch stared at the coins, then at her. He saw no tears, no pleading. He saw only a terrifying, unreadable resolve. He sighed, a man dealing with a foolishness he could not comprehend. He took the money and retrieved the tools from the back. They were heavy, their handles smooth and untested. She spent her last dollar on a small sack of salt and a length of sturdy rope. With the axe handle balanced on one shoulder and the shovel on the other, she walked out of the store and did not look back. She turned her back on the neat wooden houses, the church steeple, the thin ribbon of smoke rising from the blacksmith's forge. She turned her back on Promise Creek and walked north, toward the worthless land that was now the only thing in the world she owned. The journey was a punishment. The trail that led from Promise Creek into the high country was little more than a game path, a winding track through thorny scrub and unforgiving inclines. The weight of the tools was a living thing, digging into the bones of her shoulders. The smooth, lacquered wood of the axe handle rubbed her palms raw within the first hour. By the third, blisters had risen, broken, and wept, leaving angry red patches of skin that seared with every movement. The sun beat down like a hammer, bleaching the color from the landscape until everything was a uniform shade of dusty brown and pale, tired green. The air grew thin and sharp. The familiar sounds of the settlement, the clang of the smithy, the distant lowing of cattle, the barking of dogs, faded behind her, replaced by the drone of insects and the lonely cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Her world shrank to the next step, and the next, the burn in her legs, the fire in her hands, and the rhythmic, jarring impact of her boots on the rocky ground. She walked until the sun began to dip below the western peaks, painting the sky in bruised colors of orange and purple. Before her, the land changed. The sparse forest gave way to a blasted heath, a landscape scarred by an old, violent fire. The trees were skeletal, their blackened limbs reaching for the sky like grasping fingers. The ground was gray with ash, and the air held a permanent, faint smell of ancient smoke. In the center of this desolation rose a low, jagged hill, a wound in the earth. It was Graves' Folly. She reached the edge of the quarry as dusk settled, and the sight of it stole the last of her strength. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not a pit. It was a chaotic gash, a jumble of fractured rock and scorched earth, where men had once tried to tear granite from the hillside. The walls were sheer black cliffs on one side, and a sloping cascade of loose scree and rubble on the other. Nothing grew here. Not a weed, not a patch of moss. It was a place where the earth itself had died. For a long moment, Ilara stood there, the heavy tools slipping from her numb fingers and clattering onto the stone. Despair, cold and absolute, washed over her. Her knees felt weak, and the sting in her eyes was not from sweat. The town was right. Mr. Finch was right. This was not a place to build a life. This was a place to die. The mockery of the deed, the final twist of her father-in-law's cruelty, was complete. He had not just exiled her, he had sent her to her own grave. She sank to the ground, the rough rock biting into her legs through her thin dress, and let the vast, silent emptiness of the place consume her. The cold came with the darkness. It was a deep, penetrating cold, born of the high altitude and the exposed stone. It seeped into her bones, a stark reminder of her vulnerability. She huddled against a large, flat slab of granite, pulling her thin shawl tighter, her body shivering uncontrollably. This was it. This was the end of her defiance. Morning would find her frozen or fled. But as the hours passed, a strange thing began to happen. The stone at her back was not growing colder. While the air around her grew sharp enough to hurt her lungs, the slab of granite she leaned against seemed to be holding a steady, neutral temperature. Curiosity, a flicker of a feeling she thought had been extinguished, stirred within her. She pressed her raw palm flat against the rock. It was not warm, not like a fire, but it was not cold. It felt stable. It was as if a deep, residual warmth was held within the very heart of the stone. She got to her feet, her joints stiff and aching. She began to move deeper into the quarry, into the most sheltered part, where the north cliff face formed a deep overhang. The air here was different. It was still, shielded from the wind that whispered over the lip of the quarry above. She ran her hands along the rock wall. The same phenomenon. The stone was a barrier not just to the wind, but to the cold itself. It had soaked up the day's heat and was now releasing it slowly, imperceptibly, fighting the encroaching chill of the night. It was thermal mass, a principle she didn't know by name, but could feel in her very bones. Then she heard it. A sound so faint she almost dismissed it as a ringing in her ears. A slow, rhythmic drip. 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 She followed the sound to the deepest corner of the overhang, a place where the cliff face met the quarry floor in a mess of fallen rock. There, from a tiny fissure in the granite, a single drop of water emerged, glittered in the faint starlight, and fell onto a patch of damp stone below. It was a seep, a steady, patient bleed of water from the deep rock. It was clean, constant, and alive. Ilara knelt, her exhaustion momentarily forgotten. She touched the dampness, then held her cupped hands beneath the fissure. It took minutes for a small pool to form, but it was cool, clear, and tasted of stone and earth. It was life. Here, in this dead place, was warmth held in the rock and water flowing from its heart. The despair that had crippled her moments before did not vanish, but it receded, pushed back by a new feeling, a grim, ferocious spark of resolve. The town was wrong. Her father-in-law was wrong. This place was not a grave. It was a foundation. The first day of work was a lesson in humility. Ilara's plan, formed in the cold clarity of dawn, was simple. Clear the rubble from under the overhang and use the stones to build a front wall, creating a simple, three-sided shelter against the cliff face. The reality was a brutal education in physics and fatigue. The stones were heavier than they looked, their jagged edges tearing at her clothes and skin. Her shovel, so new and promising in the mercantile, scraped uselessly against rock slabs that refused to budge. She spent the entire morning moving a single, waist-high boulder. She pushed, she heaved, she threw her entire body against it, until her muscles screamed and black spots danced in her vision. It did not move. Defeated and gasping for air, she sat on the dusty ground, looking at her enemy of a rock. Then she remembered the fire-hardened trees on the ridge. Using her axe, she chopped down a slender, sturdy sapling, hacking at it with clumsy, inefficient swings. She stripped its branches and dragged it back to the quarry. Shoving one end under the boulder and using a smaller rock as a fulcrum, she put her full weight on the long end of the pole. The boulder groaned, scraped, and then, with agonizing slowness, rolled over. It was a small victory, but it felt like a miracle. She had not defeated the rock with strength, but with a lever. It was the first secret the land had taught her. The days bled into one another, each marked by the rising and setting of the sun and the slow, painful progress of her work. Her body transformed. The soft flesh of her hands hardened into a landscape of calluses. The muscles in her back, arms, and legs, once accustomed to the gentler labors of a farm, became dense and ropey. She learned the language of stone, how to spot a fracture line, how to judge a rock's balance, how to use smaller stones to wedge larger ones into place. She built her front wall without mortar at first, a dry stack barrier of carefully chosen, interlocking rocks. It was slow, frustrating work. The wall collapsed twice, a heartbreaking cascade of her labor tumbling back into a useless pile. The second time it fell, she sat amongst the rubble and wept, not from despair, but from sheer, soul-crushing exhaustion. But the next morning she began again, restacking the stones with a patience born of necessity. This time she paid more attention to the base, setting the largest, flattest stones first to create a stable footing. The wall grew, a jagged but solid line between her nascent home and the hostile world. While the wall rose, she worked on her other systems. The water seep was her most precious resource. She used her shovel to dig a small basin into the earth at the base of the fissure, then spent 2 days searching the surrounding hills for a patch of clay soil mentioned in an old farmer's almanac her husband had once owned. She found it a mile away, a thick gray vein of it exposed by a landslide. She hauled it back in sack after sack made from pieces of her own petticoats, a grueling task that left her caked in dust and sweat. She lined the basin with the wet clay, smoothing it with her hands until it formed a waterproof bowl, a small, crude cistern that could hold 20 gallons of clean, fresh water. Heat was the next challenge. The geothermal warmth of the stone was a blessing, but it would not be enough to fight the deep cold of winter. She needed fire. A simple fire pit would fill her small space with smoke. She looked up at the cliff face above her shelter and noticed a dark, vertical crack, a fissure running from 20 feet up all the way to the top of the quarry. It was a natural chimney. The idea was audacious. She would build a fireplace into the back wall of her shelter, directly beneath the fissure. This was the most difficult work yet. It required cutting into the solid granite of the cliff. She used the sharp end of her shovel and a heavy rock as a hammer, chipping away tiny fragments of stone for days on end. The sound was a constant, maddening tink, tink, tink that echoed through the quarry. It was mind-numbing, muscle-shredding labor. But after a week, she had carved out a shallow alcove, a firebox. She built the hearth around it with flat stones and used more of her precious clay to seal the gaps, directing the smoke upwards toward the fissure. The first time she lit a fire, she held her breath. A plume of smoke billowed out, choking her, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought she had failed. Then, as the heat grew, a draft caught. The smoke swirled and was suddenly pulled upwards, disappearing into the dark crack in the rock. It worked. The stone around the firebox grew warm to the touch, and that warmth slowly spread through the entire back wall, turning her shelter into a massive, slow-release radiator. One afternoon, while checking a snare line she had set for rabbits, she was not the only one interested in her catch. A dog, skeletal and wary, was sniffing at the snared rabbit. It was a creature of bone and matted black fur, its ribs stark against its hide. It regarded her with intelligent, fearful eyes. She did not shout or raise her axe. She backed away slowly, leaving the rabbit. She had nothing to spare, but she recognized in the animal the same desperate will to survive that burned in her own chest. The next day, the dog was there again, watching her from a distance as she worked. She tossed it a piece of cooked meat. It snatched the offering and retreated, but its tail gave a single, tentative wag. She named him Rook, for his dark color and his silent, watchful presence. He became her shadow, a companion in the vast loneliness. He never barked without reason, but his low growl was a reliable alarm, and the simple, warm weight of him sleeping at her feet at night was a comfort beyond measure. By the time the first hints of autumn began to color the hardy scrub on the hills, her shelter was complete. It was not a house. It was a semi-subterranean den, dug into the earth and walled with stone, with a low roof of heavy logs covered in sod. The single door was made of planks salvaged from a collapsed section of an old quarry ramp, thick and sturdy. But inside, it was a sanctuary. It was dry, and with a small fire burning, it was warm. The cistern was full, and the rock walls radiated a gentle, constant heat. But she knew it was not enough. Shelter was one thing, survival was another. She needed a sustainable source of food that did not rely on her snares. She needed to go back to Promise Creek. Her return to the town was an event. As she walked down the main street, leading Rook on his rope leash, conversations stopped. People emerged from their homes and businesses to stare. She was no longer the pale, grieving widow. She was a woman hardened by the sun and the stone, her clothes stained and patched, her hands calloused, her face framed by hair bleached by the sun. She looked feral, strong, and utterly out of place. She walked directly to the mercantile. Mr. Finch was on the boardwalk, overseeing the unloading of a wagon. He saw her coming, and his face registered a kind of weary disbelief, as if he were seeing a ghost he had long since dismissed. "Ilara," he said, his voice stripped of its earlier confidence. "You're alive." "I am," she replied, her tone even. "I need supplies." Inside the store, she did not buy flour or beans. She laid out a small pile of carefully cleaned and bundled rabbit pelts on the counter. "I need to trade," she said, "for 2 laying hens, a young goat if you have one, and seeds, potatoes, carrots, turnips." Mr. Finch looked at the pelts, then at her. The absurdity of her request was too much for him to contain. A laugh escaped him, short and sharp. "Hens? A goat? Good woman, where do you plan to keep them? In that hole in the ground? They'll freeze or be eaten by wolves before the first snow." The men who had been unloading the wagon had followed them in and were listening, their faces smirking. The story of her folly had become a town legend, a cautionary tale told over beer and cards. "I'll manage," Ilara said, her gaze unwavering. "It's madness," Finch declared, shaking his head as he addressed the other men as much as her. "Building a bunker in a rock pile. It's a kind of paranoia, that's what it is. Stone bunker paranoia." The men chuckled. The name was perfect. It was catchy, dismissive, and painted a perfect picture of her lunacy. But he was a merchant first, and a moralist second. The pelts were of good quality. He made the trade, shaking his head the entire time. He sold her 2 scrawny hens, a stubborn she-goat, and a small sack of seeds, clearly believing he was sending the poor creatures to their doom. Leading a goat on a rope and carrying 2 squawking chickens in a crate, Ilara walked back through the town, the new nickname trailing behind her like a plume of smoke. "Stone bunker paranoia," they whispered. "The folly girl and her menagerie." Back in her quarry, the real work of creating a food system began. She did not try to plant outside. Instead, she chose the warmest part of her bunker, near the firebox, where the geothermal heat was strongest. She spent another week hauling soil from a fertile patch she'd found in a sheltered valley, carrying it on a makeshift sled. She built a low stone wall to create a raised bed on the bunker floor, a subterranean garden shielded from the wind, the frost, and the snow. In this manufactured earth, she planted her potato eyes, her carrot seeds, and her turnips. She built a small adjoining pen for the animals, walled with stone and connected to the main living space so they could share the warmth. The goat, which she named Gray, proved to be a good browser, clearing the thorny scrub around the quarry and providing a small but steady supply of milk. The chickens, safe in their stone enclosure, began to lay eggs, small brown miracles she treated like jewels. Her world was becoming a closed, self-sustaining loop. The fire warmed the stone warmed the air, the garden, and the animals. The animals provided food, which fueled her labor. It was a system built of rock, earth, fire, and sheer, unrelenting will. The mockery from the town did not cease. It solidified. Her trip for the animals had cemented her reputation as the local eccentric, a figure of dark amusement. Stone Bunker Paranoia became her unofficial title in Promise Creek. When Brant, a grizzled local trapper, passed by her quarry while checking his lines, he stopped and stared at the wisp of smoke rising from the invisible chimney fissure. He saw the sturdy door, the sod roof blending into the hillside. He cupped his hands around his mouth. "You expecting the world to end in there, girl?" he shouted, his laughter echoing off the rock walls. Ilara, who was inside, mending a tear in her shirt, did not answer. She simply added another log to the fire, the steady crackle of the flames a more satisfying response than any words. Her world had shrunk to the size of her shelter, and the opinions of the town outside it had begun to lose their power. Winter arrived not as a gentle blanket, but as an invading army. The wind howled over the quarry's edge, a constant, mournful scream. Snow fell, thick and relentless, burying the black, skeletal trees and smoothing the harsh lines of the land into a sea of white. To the people of Promise Creek, it was a season to be endured. They huddled in their wooden houses, drafts snaking through the floorboards, their survival measured in cords of firewood and sacks of flour. For Ilara, it was a time of quiet, ordered routine. Her days were governed by the needs of the systems she had built. At dawn, she would rise in the gentle, fire-lit warmth of the bunker. The air was cool, but never freezing. The first task was always the fire, adding logs she had spent the entire autumn felling, splitting, and stacking against the inside wall. Then, she would milk Gray the goat, her hands working deftly in the dim light. The sound of the milk hitting the bottom of the pail was a sound of life, a rhythm of sustenance. She would tend to her subterranean garden, a patch of impossible green in the heart of winter. The potato vines grew, pale but healthy in the low light, and the tops of carrots and turnips pushed through the dark soil. The warmth from the firebox and the insulated earth created a microclimate where life persisted. The chickens clucked softly in their pen, providing an egg every day or two. She was utterly alone, with only Rook for company, but she was not lonely. She was the sovereign of her small, warm, living world, a kingdom of one carved from the stone. The winter offered smaller tests before the great one. A mid-January thaw, followed by a snap freeze, coated the quarry in a treacherous sheet of ice. Her door was frozen shut. She spent half a day chipping away at the ice with the butt of her axe until she could break free. It taught her to build a small, stone overhang above the door to prevent it from happening again. Later, a pack of wolves, made bold by hunger, descended from the high peaks. She heard their howls, closer than ever before. Rook stood at the door, a low, rumbling growl in his chest, the fur on his back raised. Ilara checked the heavy bar on her door and added wood to the fire. The wolves circled the quarry, their dark shapes moving against the white snow, drawn by the scent of the goat. But they could find no purchase on the sheer walls, no weakness in the stone and sod. Her home was a fortress. In the morning, they were gone, leaving only their tracks in the snow. The incident did not frighten her. It confirmed the strength of her design. She was not just surviving, she was secure. The spring and summer of 1891 were hot and dry. The creeks that fed Promise Creek shrank, and the grass in the pastures turned brown and brittle by July. The farmers worried, their gazes constantly turning to the cloudless, metallic sky. By August, the air was thick with a dusty haze, and the sun was a merciless, white-hot disk. The forests on the high ridges were tinderboxes waiting for a spark. The spark came on a Tuesday afternoon. A dry lightning storm rolled through the peaks, its thunder echoing like cannon fire across the valley. There was no rain, only jagged forks of electricity striking the parched earth. One bolt struck a massive dead pine on the ridge north of Ilara's quarry. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a thin curl of white smoke rose into the air, followed by a sudden, explosive burst of orange flame. The wind, which had been still all day, began to stir. It came from the north, a hot, dry gust that fanned the fledgling blaze. The fire found the dry underbrush and roared to life. It moved with terrifying speed, a living thing, a monster of heat and hunger. It devoured the forest, crowning in the treetops with a sound like a freight train. Inside her stone bunker, Elara felt the change first, as a shift in the air, a scent of smoke sharper and more acrid than that from her own fire. Rook began to pace restlessly, whining low in his throat. She opened the heavy door a crack and looked out. The sky to the north was no longer blue. It was a churning wall of black and orange. The roar was no longer distant. It was the sound of the world being torn apart. She did not panic. She closed and barred the door. She checked her cistern. It was full. She checked her food stores, smoked rabbit, dried goat cheese, sacks of root vegetables from her garden. She had enough for months. The fire raged over the quarry. She could hear the roar, a deafening, all-consuming vortex of sound. The air in the bunker grew warmer as the rock above heated, but it remained clean and breathable. The fire could not touch her. It could not burn stone. It could not penetrate the earth. While the world outside became an inferno, her small, ordered sanctuary held. She sat on her stool, Rook's head in her lap, and listened to the storm of flame pass over her. In Promise Creek, there was no such sanctuary. The town was a collection of kindling. The wind drove the fire down the valley with the speed of a galloping horse. Embers the size of fists rained down, carried on the superheated air. They landed on the dry shake roofs of the houses, the mercantile, the church. The town's volunteer fire brigade was useless. The wells were low, and the heat was so intense it drove the men back. One roof caught, then another. Panic erupted. Families grabbed what they could and fled, their screams swallowed by the roar of the fire. Mr. Finch's mercantile, with its stores of oil and dry goods, went up like a torch. The wooden structures that had been a source of pride, a symbol of their taming of the wilderness, became their funeral pyres. The community's confidence, their sensible plans, their entire world, shattered and burned in a matter of hours. Their infrastructure had failed. Their preparations were a joke. The fire consumed it all. The night was a vision of hell, lit by the orange glow of the dying town. The air was a choking blanket of smoke and ash. Out of this apocalyptic landscape, a figure stumbled through the darkness, coughing, weeping, moving with the desperate energy of a mother. It was Martha Finch, Mr. Finch's wife. In her arms, she carried her young son, Thomas, who was limp and gasping, his face pale beneath a layer of soot. She had fled the flames, her only thought to get away, to find clean air. Instinct, or perhaps a half-remembered piece of town gossip, drove her north, toward the one place the fire could not touch. She scrambled up the rocky path to the quarry, her lungs burning, and saw the impossible. A single, solid door set into the hillside, untouched by the devastation around it. She pounded on the wood with what was left of her strength, her voice a raw croak. "Please, help us, please!" Inside, Elara heard the frantic banging over the diminishing roar of the fire. Rook was at the door, not growling but whining, a sound of distress. She slid the heavy bar back and opened the door. The heat and smoke washed in. Before her stood Martha Finch, her face a mask of terror and soot, clutching her child. The irony was a bitter taste in Elara's mouth. Here was the wife of the man who had named her Paranoia, who had laughed at her preparations, now begging at her door. For a fleeting second, the memory of his smug face, the chuckles of the men in the store, flashed in her mind. She could close the door. She could preserve her carefully rationed air and water, her hard-won security. It would be justice, of a sort. But then she looked at the child in his mother's arms, his small chest struggling for each breath. She looked at the mother's desperate eyes. This was not about justice. This was about life. Her choice was clear. made in an instant. She helped not because they deserved it, but because she could. "Come in," Elara said, her voice calm and steady. She took the boy from his mother's arms and carried him inside, away from the poison air. She laid him gently on her own cot and dipped a clean rag in her cistern, wiping the soot from his face. Martha collapsed just inside the door, sobbing in a mixture of relief and grief. Elara helped her to a stool and gave her a dipper of cool, clean water. She had risked her own safety for the family of a man who had scorned her. She had opened her sanctuary. The effect of entering the bunker was staggering. Martha Finch stopped crying and simply stared, her eyes wide with disbelief. The air was warm, but clean and breathable. A small, steady fire burned in a stone hearth, its smoke drawn cleanly away. Against one wall, a garden of green plants grew in the dim light. In a pen, a goat and 2 chickens shifted calmly, unbothered. The space was ordered, peaceful, and alive. It was not the miserable hovel she had imagined. It was an ark. "How?" she whispered, looking from the garden to the cistern, to the neatly stacked firewood. "How is this possible?" Elara did not answer immediately. She was focused on the boy, coaxing him to drink a little water. His breathing was already easing in the clean air. The contrast between the hellscape outside and the quiet order within was so profound it seemed to break something in Martha's mind. The narrative of the foolish girl in the cave shattered against the undeniable reality of this place. An hour later, another figure appeared at the door, a man silhouetted against the red glow of the smoldering ruins. It was Mr. Finch. He was covered in soot and burns, his clothes torn, his face a mask of defeat. He had seen his wife's tracks leading north and had followed them, fearing the worst. He saw the open door and braced himself for what he might find inside. He stepped across the threshold and froze. The first thing that hit him was the warmth, a gentle, enveloping heat so different from the ravenous blaze he had just escaped. Then his eyes adjusted to the light. He saw his wife, safe. He saw his son, breathing, alive. And then he saw the rest of it. The impossible garden, the livestock, the full cistern, the calm, quiet strength of the woman he had mocked. He looked at Elara, who was now ladling broth from a pot into a bowl. He looked at the solid stone walls, the sod roof, the ingenious fireplace. Everything he had dismissed as paranoia was the very thing that had saved his family. His own sensible house was a pile of ash. His mercantile was gone. His entire world, built on conventional wisdom, had been erased. Her foolish bunker was the only thing left standing. The shame and the truth of it broke him. His shoulders sagged, and a dry, racking sob escaped his throat. He leaned against the stone wall, the very stone he had mocked, for support. "We were wrong," he said, his voice cracking. The words were a surrender, an admission of a failure so complete it was absolute. "We called you a fool." My God! He looked around the shelter, his eyes filled with a terrible, dawning reverence. We were the fools. Elara looked up from the bowl of broth. There was no triumph in her eyes, no hint of, "I told you so." Her expression was one of quiet, weary compassion. She had won, but she took no pleasure in his defeat. Her victory was not over him. It was over the fire, the cold, and the wilderness. She held out the bowl to him. Her grace was her final, greatest strength. "There is food," she said simply. "Eat." In the days that followed, Elara's stone bunker became the heart of what was left of Promise Creek. As the fire burned itself out, the survivors, huddled in makeshift camps, learned that the Finches were alive. They followed the tracks to the quarry and discovered the miracle for themselves. They found not a madwoman in a hole, but a savior in a fortress. Elara shared what she had. She gave them water from her cistern, vegetables from her garden, and the warmth of her fire. She did not gloat or demand apologies. She simply provided. The name they had given her in mockery, Stone Bunker Paranoia, was retired. In its place, people simply called her Ilara, but they said it with a new tone of awe and deep respect. Mr. Finch, once a pillar of the community, was now a humbled man who deferred to her judgment on all matters of survival. He helped organize the survivors, but it was to her they looked for guidance. The community did not abandon Promise Creek. They rebuilt. But they did not rebuild as before. The lessons of the fire had been burned into them. Following Ilara's example, they built with stone and earth. They dug cellars and root shelters, understanding the insulating power of the ground. They designed their new homes to be fire-resistant, with sod roofs and stone hearths built to draw smoke efficiently. The new town that rose from the ashes was humbler, wiser, and far more resilient than the one that had burned. Ilara's story spread. Travelers passing through the rebuilt town carried the tale of the woman who built a home from a cursed rock pile and saved a community. Her methods, born of necessity and quiet ingenuity, were adopted in other frontier settlements facing harsh climates. Her quarry was no longer Graves' Folly. It became a landmark, a testament to the power of one person's refusal to be broken. The landscape itself had been changed by her will, first by her tools, and then by her example. She never sought a position of leadership, yet she became the moral center of the new Promise Creek. She remained in her bunker, expanding her garden, adding a small dairy, and trading her surplus for things she could not make. Her home was a place of peace and security, a quiet haven she had wrested from the most worthless piece of land in the valley. She had built not just a shelter, but a life on her own terms. Watching the sunset from her doorway, with Rook now old and gray at her feet, she found a deep, quiet peace. She had been stripped of everything, but in losing it all, she had discovered the unshakable foundation of her own character. This story is a testament to the idea that true wealth is not in what we own, but in what we can build when we have nothing. It is a reminder that what society discards as worthless can hold the secret to survival, and that the greatest strength is not in being right, but in having the grace to help those who were wrong. Resilience is not just enduring hardship, but creating a new world from its ashes. If this story moved you, share it with someone who believes in the power of quiet strength and building something from nothing. And follow for more inspirational stories of courage, survival, and wisdom.